here's a professor telling you to blow on the fly. Hey, James. Hey, that poetry stuff. The gentleman reading that, did he write?
Yeah.
He wasn't reading it. It's not up there.
I thought it wasn't up there. So that was unbelievable. That was just great. Yes, I was just blown away. Are you going to introduce me? You want me to introduce you first? I'll introduce you. You introduce me. You introduce her. You know, there's this infinite regress of introductions going back. I'm ready when you guys are ready to rock and roll. Hoochie coo. I'm gonna get done with this quick, so I know people are tired. We're gonna get out of here and have more fun.
Well, let me see if I have something.
I think we're good to go. You guys are troopers for hanging in there all day, so thank you for doing that. In your honor, I'll have more hydrogen.
How much did they bring tonight? Yeah, how full did you bring?
All right. All right, so we have one more session. First of all, let me make some quick announcements. First, Dr. Stewart, who just spoke from New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, he has a table out here with some stuff on it, and you can buy it. And I encourage you to. He's I don't know. I think these are mostly books that he's edited, but he's edited and contributed to many things. And there are some DVD. There's some form of media out there, as well as books, and I encourage you to purchase them. Every purchase supports a starving family, as I understand it, and that would be his own. So feel free to contribute.
Support needy children.
Two other things. Right by the front entrance, there is just several. There are several things on the table, all related to Ratio Christi. Anything that you see there, you want the armbands or the calendar that really only has 1 month left to help you out. But it also has some good apologetic arguments in there too. So anything you see, feel free to take it. We have an email sign-up sheet. If you want to be on the email list, please sign up, and I'll send you out what we have. Also, there is one other sheet I made out there. There may be, especially if you're new to the interest in apologetics, you may have no idea what's out there. And there's so many resources available to you. So I've made a sheet. It's just one sheet, with what I can fit to get you started. So if you didn't see it, take that with you. There's some blog sites, some video sites, some free courses in theological education. If you're thinking about seminary degrees, there's a couple in there to consider. Take that with you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bentley.
Hi, I'm Bentley. I'm the Secretary of RC, and just on behalf of our organization, thank you so much for coming out, and thank you to our wonderful guest speakers tonight. It was great.
Yay.
I'm going to reintroduce to you Dr. Richard G Powell. He has taught courses in philosophy at several universities, including University of Mississippi and Mississippi State University. Most recently, Dr. Howe has served as Professor of Philosophy and Apologetics and the Director of the PhD program at Southern Evangelical Seminary. He is a contributing author to the Christian Research Journal with several books on apologetics. He has lectured extensively in the areas of philosophy and Christian apologetics in the U.S., Canada, Africa, and across Europe. So please welcome.
Woohoo! All right. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you so much. Well, now you need to if you're thinking of, by the way, could we get those lights any brighter? Because my retinas are still working. So I'm trying to see if I can just burn them completely out of my head while I'm up here. If you are interested in graduate school in apologetics, you want to seriously think about New Orleans. They've got some great, you've seen two of their professors here today, and they are doing a whole lot in this regard. However, if you have a morbid fear of hurricanes, Okay, so you just can't find yourself moving to New Orleans, then you might want to consider Southern Evangelical Seminary, which to my knowledge has only been hit by one hurricane in the history, because it's in Charlotte, North Carolina, so usually by the time the storms get there, they're not really hurricanes, except for Hugo. That was the only one. All right, let me try a thought experiment here, all right? So just work with me on this. Just do this in your head as I guide you. Select a number between 1 and 10, just in your head. Just pick a number between 1 and 10, all right? Multiply that number times 9. All right, now if you come out with a 2-digit number, like say 44, then add the digits together, whatever. So it would be 4 and 4 would be 8. All right, now whatever that number is, subtract 5 from that. All right, now the leftover, count that many letters into the alphabet. Now take that letter and think of a state in the United States that starts with that letter. Now take the second letter of that name of that state and think of an animal that begins with that letter. Now think of the color of that animal. Now how many of you are thinking of a gray elephant? Right, okay. Okay, pretty good, huh? I'm like a Creskin going on up here. Well, thanks so much for hanging in there the last part of the seminar, the conference, and one of the things that is exciting about Southern Evangelical Seminary is it has the distinct honor of having basically birthed Ratio Christi. So for the first few years of its existence, it was actually under the auspices, and I have no idea why I did my hands like that. For some reason, that's the hand signal for under the auspices or whatever an auspice is. And so it flourished under the auspices of the seminary for several years before it became viable. They cut the umbilical cord, and I can just extend the birth metaphor as far as you want here. And now it's on its own. It's over 100 and how many chapters now? Between the, how many? 100, so well over about 125 or whatever it is, chapters across the United States and some overseas. So just excited about what you guys are doing. I appreciate the leadership putting this conference on. Now, you see the title slide here. It says Answering the Arguments of Popular Atheism. But what I'm going to do is segment out just part of that presentation and deal with basically just the scientific arguments, and even still a handful of those. So what is popular atheism? What do I even mean by that expression? By and large, what I mean, you could probably use other phrases besides popular atheism. You could call it, I like to call it bumper sticker atheism. And I'm not insulting by calling it bumper sticker atheism, because there's bumper sticker Christianity, isn't there? Jesus is my co-pilot, in case of rapture, this car will be unmanned. You've seen those kind of stickers. So Christians, we do the same thing. There's nothing wrong with that. Bumper stickers and T-shirts are ways of getting conversation started. So no one pretends like, because I've been able to reduce these complex ideas to a bumper sticker, that I've said everything there is to say. However, sometimes the bumper stickers or T-shirts or whatever can appear to be cheating, because they seem to leverage some plays on words or stuff that almost is unfair. So we'll see as we go through when we talk about popular atheism and such. Another idea that I have in mind when I call this popular atheism is that any scholar can write material which is called popular material. And what that means is not that everybody likes it or it's real well known. It means it's written basically free of technical jargon. It's free of all the technical things that the experts and the technicians in the field would be privy to. So it's perfectly legitimate. In fact, it's really laudable, I think, for a lot of scholars who sometimes make it their life's work sometimes to target the non-technicians in their field. And so they want, like Mortimer Adler did this with philosophy. Stephen Jay Gould did this with science. And others have done that in their disciplines, where they try to make it something that the layperson can come to enjoy and understand to a certain extent. So that's kind of what I mean by popular atheism. So if I bring a name up in this context, like say a Richard Dawkins, for example, if his name happens to come up, I don't mean by that that any particular person I name is not a scholar in any sense of the term. I just mean in the relevant sense of what I'm going to be talking about here, they've written things in a non-technical way at a popular level for people who want to know a little bit more about it. So what are some of these arguments? Well, what I did in the full presentation was when I started looking at these kind of T-shirt, bumper sticker kinds of one-liners, I started thinking they seem to fall into three broad categories. The first were what I call rhetorical arguments. And by that I mean they were just clever plays on words. In fact, some of them are very clever. And because they're so clever, they're really just arrest your attention. They just grab your attention and go, wow, that is, like one of my favorite is axial tilt is the reason for the season. You know, if you understand astronomy, and you're like, oh, that's pretty clever, because we say Jesus is the reason of the season. They say axial tilt is the reason. Some of them are pretty hard-hitting, and I think mask a colossal and profound misunderstanding of the Christian faith. One of them, for example, in the rhetorical category would be science flies you to the moon, religion flies you into buildings. I've seen that on bumper stickers and T-shirts. So I have a battery of these rhetorical arguments that I try to deal with. The second category that I'm not going to deal with tonight are philosophical type arguments, where, you know, well, if God made the universe, then who made God? Or if God is the cause of the complexity of the world, then what's the cause of the complexity of God? Who designed the designer? Those kinds of philosophical type of challenges. Can God make a rock too heavy for him to pick up? I like Homer Simpson's version of that. Was, can Jesus microwave his taco too hot for him to eat it? That was his version of the, can God make a rock too heavy for him to pick up? So what I'm going to focus on are scientific arguments. And in the honor of being scientific, I was going to have some more hydrogen. You know, do you get that theme? It's pretty cool. I just worked out, see, because, hey, they don't give this job to chimps, you know. You know, right? So, excuse me just a minute. Dramatic pause. By the way, if I ever do that and I choke, we just get out early. We said, we'll just all go home. We're going, what? I think he's done. I'm lying back. All right, so what are some of these scientific arguments? Well, and these don't come in necessarily any particular order. First, Christianity has always stood against the advances of science. Let me just run through what the arguments are. We're not going to do them all, but I'll just let you know what they are. And by the way, these are all ready to be uploaded to the internet as soon as I get back to my room tonight. I told you this morning I would put the two presentations in a PDF deck. So tonight, wait till I get home. I got to do it all. But hopefully by tomorrow, the world doesn't end. If you go to my website, which is richardghowe.com. So in this sudden attack of humility, I bought a domain and named it after myself. It's like, what could I call my domain? I'll name it after me. Isn't that cool? richardghowe.com. What's cool about buying a domain, if you've never done this, I got like 100 emails. You could do up to 100 emails within a certain amount of space. So you could have 100 different names. And I was thinking, I had a whole bunch of emails that I was using for various aspects of my work at the seminary. I thought, I'd like to have an email that was anonymous. So you could maybe email people and they wouldn't be obvious where it was from. And I came out with a great email address. It's bet you can't guess who this is at richardghowe.com. So I've got it right there. That's going to be great. All right, how about another one? I'll get these out and then we'll go back and talk about a few of them as time allows. Christianity has reacted against science because science has displaced man from the center of the universe. By the way, how many of you have ever heard this characterization? I've struggled with this in graduate school. The Bible was written by the same people who believed that the earth was flat. I'm not even going to deal with this one tonight, except to say that by the time of Aristotle, 350 years before Christ, they pretty much knew that the earth was a sphere. And it's a myth that the Portuguese explorer somehow discovered the sphericalness of the earth. Aristotle actually gives an argument for the spherical shape of the earth 350 years before Christ. So the most you could say about this one is perhaps some of the Old Testament prophets were contemporary with flat earth thinking. but certainly well before the New Testament time, nobody really championed an idea that the earth was anything but spherical. But that's about all I'll say about it for the time being. Most scientists are atheists, therefore the belief in God is not scientific. Virtual particles prove that it's possible for something to come into existence uncaused out of nothing. Therefore, the universe could have come into existence uncaused out of nothing. And you recognize that as a response to the argument that the science seems to prove that the universe had a beginning a finite time ago. And so if it had a beginning, it had a beginner, because it couldn't have just come into existence out of nothing. And they go, oh, wait a minute, we actually have found examples of things coming into existence out of nothing, known as virtual particles. We'll see if we can get to that one. As a maker of the biological complexity of the world, God himself would be no less complex and therefore would himself need a causal explanation. So let's take these one at a time and see if we can answer some of these arguments, specifically these scientific arguments. Let's deal with the first one. Christianity has always stood against the advances of science. And in my experience, having stumbled on this for the first time and then sort of following the conversation off and on over the years as a professor of apologetics and professor of philosophy, I've noticed how often people have this opinion. In fact, it's more than just a popular atheist notion. It actually exists in some scholarly material, like, for example, Bertrand Russell, who is probably one of the most brilliant philosophers of logic ever. And he's just a remarkable thinker in his own right. And his history of Western philosophy actually talks about this idea that because of the influences of, or say the countervailing influences of Christianity, a lot of times science was just arrested in its development because the Christians were just so recalcitrant. I just had to use the word recalcitrant before midnight, because I belong to the society of people who use the word recalcitrant at least once every time they speak. So I got it in. That was a close call, but I made it. You know, this idea that the history of Christianity vis-a-vis science is one of conflict and war was put into the public conversation primarily through the influence of two people. All right, one is this gentleman here. Let me get his name. Hang on a second so you can see that. You can't see his name at the bottom. Draper. Now, I'm sorry that's a little hard to read because my font didn't carry through with the border. But in effect, Draper, and let me show you the other one right quick while I've got them on the mind, and Andrew D. White. Both of these gentlemen were scholars. White, for example, was the first president of Cornell University. His second wife, after he was widowed, was the first woman to ever earn a PhD in the United States. Draper was the first president of the American Chemical Society. So both of these guys are scholars in their own right. But both of them, through their works, the history of the warfare between science and religion and these kind of things, contributed to this myth that Christianity and science have been at war ever since there was one or the other. What can I say in response to that? Probably the best, most direct answer was given by Ronald Numbers from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He says, the greatest myth in the history of science and religion holds that they have been in a state of constant conflict. No one bears more responsibility for promoting this notion than two 19th century polemicists, Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper. And he's referring to both of those works that I just made a reference to. By the way, Numbers, he heads up a program at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and the program is the history of science. He heads up a PhD program in the history of science. Not the history of the philosophy of science, but the history of science, which means it's primarily historians. And what you will find is there are, to my knowledge, no legitimate, bona fide historian, Christian or not Christian. You will not find one, to my knowledge, who will concur that the history of the relationship of science and Christianity is one of conflict and such. So the book, in my opinion, that wins the prize of one of the coolest titles, and I'll make several references to this, and I brought this, and you can come look at it if you want. It's titled, this is by Numbers, he edited it. It's titled, Galileo Goes to Jail. and other myths about science and religion. I was to say something about Galileo here in due course. Another historian of science, well, first of all, before I get to that, Francis Collins. How many of you know who Francis Collins is with the Human Genome Project, right? Says one of the greatest tragedies of our time is this impression that has been created that science and religion have to be at war. In fact, Collins gives Richard Dawkins a headache because Dawkins likes to, dramatic pause, Dawkins likes to characterize Christianity as being anti-science. The problem is he chokes on Francis Collins because he can't deny Francis Collins' scientific credentials, and he also can't deny the fact that Francis Collins is a committed Christian. But what more can we say about this supposed myth? Well, here's the truth about how Christianity and, quote, science relate. The medieval Roman Catholic Church gave more financial and social support to the study of astronomy for over 6 centuries than any other and probably all other institutions. And by the way, why would you think the Christian church would be interested in astronomy? Any guesses? Why would that matter to, let's say, the Roman Catholic Church? Because they were doing what?
They're trying to see heaven.
See heaven? Yeah, that might be. One of the things that mattered so much, and still does to many liturgical traditions, is the liturgical calendar. When does Easter come? When do the festivals come? So, sure, they might have had religious motivations for why they were so concerned about accurate astronomy. But the fact remains, more advances in astronomical knowledge came at the behest and the funding of Christianity than any other and probably all other institutions combined. The medieval period gave birth to the university, which developed with the support of the papacy. By 1500, there were about 60 universities across Europe, educating a cumulative total of several 100,000 students. In fact, about 30% of the curriculum covered subjects and texts concerned with the natural world, or what you and I refer to as science. And by the way, you're aware of the fact that the distinctions we now draw, let's say, between philosophy and science is a very modern distinction. It's probably post-17th century. Before that really began. Now, if you go to the philosophy department, you can't even see the science buildings from the philosophy building on a typical university campus. Because so in a lot of people's mind, they have almost nothing to do with each other. But from about the 17th century back all the way to Aristotle, science just was knowledge. Whether that was knowledge about the physical world, or whether that was knowledge about metaphysics, or whether that was knowledge about ethics, or whether that was knowledge about anything else. It was just knowledge. And you read Aristotle, and you can seamlessly go from a treatise on deep metaphysics to a treatise on botany, because for Aristotle, he was just concerned about knowledge. So today we like to talk as if these distinctions were very clear throughout Western history. And again, it's a very recent way in which we demarcated religion and philosophy and stuff, and then science. They weren't so divided. Michael Shank, another professor of historian of science. Between 1150 and 1500, more literate Europeans had access to scientific materials than any of their predecessors in earlier cultures, thanks largely to the emergence, rapid growth, and naturalistic arts curriculum of medieval universities. So far from the church digging its heels in to resist science, it was 180 degrees the opposite. It facilitated the science. It never saw anything in what we now refer to as the natural sciences. It never saw any of those is in any way a threat to any dogma of the church. In fact, it's even more than that, as we'll see in a moment when we talk about Galileo. Again, he says, if the medieval church had intended to suppress the inquiry into nature, it must have been completely powerless, for it utterly failed to reach its goal. Well, in fact, Bertrand Russell tries to explain the fact that, if the church was trying so hard to stave off the advances of science, why did it seemingly fail if at the same time the church supposedly wielded such political power? And the only thing Russell could come up with was, if you get out away from Italy and more of the Protestant-dominated countries where the Catholic Church didn't have as much political power, then you have a little bit more science going on. The problem with that thesis is, despite Russell's claim that after the Galileo affair, science was arrested in Italy for almost 2 centuries, science actually just continued to flourish even after the supposed fight between Galileo and the church. So it's just factually not true that the church and science have been at war with one another for all this time. And as I said, to my knowledge, there's not one historian, including Ronald Numbers or Michael Shanks or Richard Blackwell or David Lindbergh or others that I'll make reference to. These aren't necessarily Christians. Not necessarily. Some of them may be, some of them may not be. But there's no bona fide historian that I'm aware of that actually entertains the idea that somehow Christianity and science are totally at odds with one another. Now, I mentioned Galileo a little bit. There's just some facts about him. You don't maybe care about these particular facts. I just had them there when we go into more detail, except maybe the years of his life and what's going on with him. But let me just say something about what was going on with Galileo. The idea that somehow Galileo, all right, let me start this way. Galileo becomes symbolic of this warfare between science and religion. And in fact, some people will go, well, Christianity's always resisted science because the Galileo affair, that really points out how bad it actually was between the Christians and the scientists. Because look what they did to Galileo. And he sort of becomes this emblematic of all the persecution that the Christians put onto the scientists of the day. What's odd is, and I actually heard an interesting lecture by a historian named Philip Samson. He actually wrote a book called, I think it's titled 6 Myths about Science and Religion. And one of them, he talks a lot about the Galileo affair. And during his lecture, he actually polls the audience about sort of brainstorming, like, what have you heard about Galileo? What do you guys remember about Galileo? And so you can hear, it's an adult class, maybe a university class or something, and you know, they say, well, you know, he dropped a bowling ball or whatever off the Leaning Tower pizza, you know, one big one and one little one to see how they go. And he invented the telescope, and he's the one that first observed and calculated that the time that it takes a pendulum to swing back and forth is independent of the degrees of the arc. That is, no matter how small as it starts to swing and gets narrower and narrower, as it gets narrower and narrower, it gets slower and slower, so it always takes the same amount of time to go from peak to peak. And he supposedly watched this candelabra swinging in church one day and was timing it with his pole. All of this stuff. And of course, then he was condemned by the church, and he languished in prison, and he was tortured by the Inquisition, and these kind of things. And so Samson carefully leads them through this brainstorming, only then to systematically go, almost none of those points are true. He didn't invent the telescope. You know, he wasn't condemned by the church. He didn't, or excommunicate, I should say. He didn't languish in prison. He wasn't tortured by the Inquisition, or none of these kind of things are true about Galileo. In fact, what's interesting about him is that Galileo had just a handful of, let me see if I can find the particular slide. He just had a handful of, let me see if this one, yeah. Hang on just a second, I'll get to it in a minute. He had just a handful of controversies that characterized his life. Probably about 5 public controversies. Newsflash, only the last few, at least the last one, and if you could divide that into several stages, only the last one was with the church. Reckon, as we'd say in Tupelo, I don't know if you say that in Oxford, reckon who the other institutions were that Galileo was in controversy with. Well, these 5 major controversies, only the last one was with the church. Which one was the others for? With the university scientists. Now, that doesn't make Galileo right or wrong. That doesn't make the university scientists right or wrong. I'm just saying, contrary to the popular myth, the whole saga of Galileo's life being characterized by these controversies was by and large controversies he had with the universities. Why? Because he was challenging the views that the university had. So 2 things really got him in trouble. He rejected the Aristotelian model of the cosmos, whatever that is. We'll see something about that in a minute. And that's what got him in trouble with the scientific community. We'll see in a moment what Aristotle's view but Aristotle's view of the nature of astronomy was something that Galileo was challenging. That's got him in trouble with the universities. His attempts to interpret the Bible to sort of shore up his arguments, that's what got him in trouble with the church. So in other words, it wasn't so much the things that Galileo thought and believed, it was the fact that Galileo had the gall to interpret the Bible. Why would that matter? Because in the 16th century, the only people that had the authority in the Christian church to weigh in on what you think a verse means were people in the priesthood. Just some Joe Blow going along. You just couldn't pick up your Bible and go, well, what does this verse mean to you? Well, it doesn't matter what it means to you. We'll tell you what it means to you because you're not trained in the priesthood and we have the authority to interpret. So when Galileo came along and he started talking about certain verses that we'll mention here in a moment, that's what got him into trouble with the church. In fact, not only is it not the case that what Galileo was saying wasn't so much got him in trouble with the church as what he was trying to do with the Bible, but Galileo wasn't saying anything about the universe, as we'll see in a moment, that wasn't already being said for almost 70 years in medieval Europe in that period of time. Galileo's views were already the staple of conversation. In fact, in some ways, when Galileo comes onto the scene, what he propounds, as we'll see in a moment, in a minute we'll do all the things I said we'll see in a moment. Do it all real fast. So keep building them up, because so far I've got 17 things that we're going to see in a moment. But by the time he comes onto the scene, there was a sense in which a lot of the ideas he had were sort of old hat. He had just revived some of these things. And there were other reasons why it became so volatile in his day, not the least of which was he was a pretty irascible character and loved to just mock his opponents. All right? So here were the controversies, the changes in the heavens, Jupiter's moons, discourses, his treatise called Discourse on Floating Bodies, sunspots, and then his response to the preaching of the Dominican friar Tommaso Cassini. Now, Jupiter's moons and sunspots were the ones that really got people. They broke out in a rash when he was propounding these things. Why? Because if Jupiter had moons, then that meant that the Earth wasn't the only thing in the universe that was at the center, that you had other centers. At least Jupiter was a center because it had moons going around it. And they're just, the scientists are going, la, 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 la. It can't be. That violates what Aristotle tells us. Sunspots also was really controversial because, according to Aristotle, the sun couldn't have spots. And the moon couldn't have blemishes because of the nature of them as heavenly bodies. So, what do? Well, the Dominican priest Niccolò Lorini sent a letter to the Inquisitor General in Rome, February 1615, outlining his concerns about the Galileos, that is, the followers of Galileo. His concern was that they wished to interpret Scripture in their own way. See, that's what they were ticked off about. And contrary to the interpretation of the Holy Fathers, and we'll look at one of those scriptures here in a moment, and that they defend a view which is apparently completely contrary to sacred Scripture, that they speak with little respect for the ancient Holy Fathers and St. Thomas, that they trample under the whole philosophy of Aristotle, and in some, that they display their cleverness by saying many impertinent things which they spread throughout our whole city. Lorini nevertheless acknowledged that, quote, all of those who call themselves Galileos are good Christians and men of means, but they're smart alecks to some extent and rigid in their opinions. What is very interesting is if you ask just typical people who have some understanding of history about Galileo and the church, as I've already said, probably a lot of people will say, yeah, you know, he got in trouble, he was excommunicated, he languished in prison, on and on and on. What's very interesting, though, is besides all the scientific stuff that we can say a little bit more about between Galileo and the church, I'll tell you a parallel dispute between Galileo and the church was Galileo's dispute over Scripture. So here's a tremendous resource. I brought it with me. Galileo, Bellarmine, and the Bible. Bellarmine was basically the main cardinal who stood against Galileo's interpretation of certain verses to try to render them consistent with his views of the universe, whatever those are. And so they go back and forth. So what Richard Blackwell did in this book is more or less, he does two things. He chronicles that debate between Bellarmine and Galileo. But you also have, for the first couple of other things, you got primary sources of Galileo and Bellarmine in here with fresh English translation. Okay, so before Blackwell does his, probably the latest English translations would have been probably somewhere in the 19th century. So it's a fresh, modern English translation of some of these primary sources. Second thing that he did is that he pulls together a number of writings of Galileo and others relevant to this whole dispute. And for the first time, they're all together in one volume. Otherwise, you kind of have to go pick books around to get the letter here and that letter there and this declaration here and stuff. So this is a absolutely fascinating chronicling and primary resources on the idea of what was going on. Now, kind of extending that a little bit, putting some meat on the scientific bones as to, well, exactly what was the dispute, if there ever was one? Christianity has reacted against science because science has displaced man from the center of the universe. I used to hear this a lot when I was a graduate student, even before then. And the idea was, well, gee, before, these scientists, Copernicus, Galileo, whomever, before they came along, the Christians were convinced that the earth was the center of the solar system, or indeed the center of the universe. And so man was at the center, and the whole rest of the cosmos all revolved around. And because, God created the earth, and he created man, and so that's his pinnacle of creation. And so, rah, 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 we're at the center. And then all of a sudden, science comes along and says, well, actually, we're not really the center. We're sort of, oblique to the center a little bit. We're actually out there going around. And so, according to this myth, the Christians get all, oh man, you just demoted us from this pristine place that God created us. Now you've demoted us by moving us off. What's going on here? Well, just a quick reconnaissance of some of these old models. You're probably familiar with the old model from Ptolemy. The old system was pioneered by the Greek astronomer Ptolemy. It really was based on the philosophy and science of Aristotle. What was that? Well, it was called, among other things, or is called, geocentrism. Now, what you see is that GHV would have been the Greek font that gets lost when I translate these slides for you to see, so apologize for that. But it's basically the Greek word gay, which is the word for earth. So where we get words like geology from the Greek word for earth. And it taught that the earth was immobile, and that the sun was moving. So you see Earth there in the middle, and you got Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And they're all, and then stars, and then public parking. No, that's not true. That'd be cool, though. It's really, you have to go way out to get to free parking. Otherwise, it's real expensive. I stole that joke. All right, so that's the old model, pioneered by Copernicus, based on the philosophy of Aristotle. What happened? Well, pioneered by Ptolemy based on the philosophy of Aristotle. The new system comes along was pioneered by the Polish astronomer Copernicus, who's about 70 plus years before Galileo. It is championed by Galileo sometime later. It was championed by the scientist Galileo. What is that model? Well, that's called heliocentrism. That would be, believe it or not, helios in Greek. Now it looks like Heliocentrism, from the Greek word for sun, taught that the sun was the center and immobile, and that the earth was moving. Now, there's a lot to say about, well, what about this verse? What about that verse? I want to talk about one particular verse here in a moment, but I have to introduce one other figure, only because he's just got a cool name, and that's Tycho Brahe, or my niece said, Uncle Richard, that's Tycho Brahe. Oh, excuse me, I just got corrected by a 13-year-old. And I was so excited. So she was studying about Tycho Brahe, or Tycho Brahe, or however you say his name. Now, what is cool about Brahe? A couple of things. One, if you ever go to Prague, the chapel there, the church right there, the Church of Our Lady Before Time. Time is a piazza. That's not what they call them in the Czech Republic, but this plaza that's on the other side. So it was in the church that was in front of, the Church of Our Lady in front of the square of Time, T-Y-N. You go into that church. Most of the churches I've been in Europe, they love you to go in and take pictures and all this kind of stuff. But every once in a while you run into one and you're not supposed to take pictures. Well, it had to be this one because one of the things I was excited about being in Prague was this is where Tycho Brahe is buried. Even though he's from the Netherlands, he makes his way to Prague, and that's where he finished out his life, and he's buried there. So it's like, so I told my wife, Rebecca, it's like, you know, man, I got to get a picture of Brahe's grave inside the. So she's got her. We're just kind of going through, and she's got her camera, you know, and like that. You've done it before, don't you lie? You know good and well you've done the same thing. So that's what she came out with. There's one of them right here. Or here's a better one of it, where he's buried in the Our Lady Before Time. Brahe's model was very interesting because whereas Ptolemy had the earth in the center and everything going around it, and Copernicus had the sun in the center and everything going around it, what Brahe had was the sun had everything going around it except the earth and the moon. And then that whole solar system was going around the earth. All right? So here's what it looked like. Sorry, let me get the right slide here. Here's what it looked like. Hang on, Richard. Let me get it here. There you go. So you see the sun has Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn all going around it. And then that whole solar system is operating around, or that are orbiting around the moon. Now, if this kind of stuff interests you, here's another good resource I brought with me. This book is titled Theories of the World from Antiquity to the Copernican Revolution. So after you get through reading David Oderberg's Real Essentialism, because you just can't put that down, it's like a page turner, then you're going to go, honey, you know, just lock the doors. I'm not leaving until I can't put this down. Theories of the World from Antiquity to the Copernican Revolution. This is actually the course syllabus that was taught at Notre Dame. I think it's Notre Dame where he taught. Is that right, Dr. Stewart? Do you know that? I think I'm right about that at any rate. So this was basically his course syllabus where he taught a semester-long class on various theories of the origin or the structure of the universe. So if you're interested in this stuff, you go, well, I'd like to read what Ptolemy has to say. What are his arguments? Or what did Copernicus say? There it is right there in all of its glory. So I highly recommend that. So what can we say to this idea that, well, gee, man was displaced from the center of the universe. That's why the Christians are so against the hard sciences. One of the things that bothered me about this idea, this happened to me while I was in graduate school, is I was learning more and more about Aristotle. And you know, again, Aristotle has the earth in the center, and then you have these sort of crystal spheres. So you have like the domain where the clouds and the birds are, and then you've got the planets, and then you got the stars and stuff like that. One of the things that occurred to me was, as we would say here, at least in Tupelo, we'd go, if you go out to these concentric spheres, according to Aristotle, reckon what is on the outermost part. Do you know what, as you go out, what is the furthest or farthest out? Does anybody know? Hurry, because my arms are, I'm starting to lose the circulation in my arms here. Heaven, and more specifically, who occupies heavens? The heavens. Yeah, angels and the gods. So I was sitting there going, so wait a minute. According to Aristotle, it seemed to me, and I'm just a little tiny graduate student. I was only like this tall. And I'm thinking, how could it be that the myth is, or not the myth, but the kind of conventional view, how could it be that we were supposedly the center of the universe, and that was a prestigious place, and the Christians are mad because science has taken us off the center and has demoted us? I said, how can that be? Because in the old model, the farther you are from the center, the better it is. It would be a promotion to be moved off from the center, because the center was the worst place to be. Today we talk about, oh, you think you're the center of everything and everything revolves around you. That's a very modern notion. That's not what Aristotle would have thought. So I thought, you would think the Christians would just be real grateful to the scientists, because if it turns out, hey, we're not the center after all, everybody went, yeah, I guess we're doing pretty good. You were a little bit closer to the gods after Copernicus came along. So I went to one of my professors, in fact, who shall remain anonymous, and I thought I had this brilliant insight. I said, Professor, It couldn't be that the scientists displaced man from the center, and that's why the Christians have gotten upset, because wouldn't being displaced from the center be a promotion in the old Aristotelian model? And he goes, nah. So I was real dejected. I was like that, you know. And I was just, you know, I kind of just lumbered around the hallways for, because I thought I was onto something, and then he totally deflated it. All right, so I put that on the shelf for a decade or more. And then I started reading and studying this issue, got very interested in the history of science, and was particularly reading things like the Numbers book, Galileo Goes to Jail, and the Bellarmine book, and another one, by the way, that I just have to mention before I get. How's this for a title of a book? When Christianity and Science Meet. It's not a science book. It's not a theology book. It's a history book. It's a history on what happened as these worldviews begin to mix questions of religion versus questions of astronomy. Great, great resource. I started reading this stuff, and lo and behold, I found a couple of resources that corroborated my thought. And I thought, wait a minute. So, for example, look what Maimonides was a medieval Jewish philosopher. In the case of the universe, the nearer the parts are to the center, the greater is their turbidness, their solidity, their inertness, their dimness and darkness, because they are further away from the loftiest element, from the source of light and brightness. This is what he actually thought. The closer you are to the center, just the kind of you are. That's where dirt and crud all just kind of like going into a sink. You know, but as you go out, that's where the air and the smoke, and then you got birds, and then clouds, and then angels, and then the gods. I said, that's exactly what I was suspecting. In fact, and by the way, Maimonides is probably the most important Jewish thinker outside Moses in the history of Jewish thought. And you're going to say, well, what about Jesus? I mean, among Jews, if you're interested in Maimonides. But Aquinas says something very similar. In the universe, Earth, that all the spheres encircle, and that, as for place, lies in the center, is the most material and coarsest. The isma ending, by the way, in Latin is like the est in English. Big est, small s, is called a superlative. So in effect, what he's saying is, it's the most ignoble of all bodies. Why? Because it lies in the center. So it couldn't be the case, as the myth goes, well, the reason why you Christians are so resistant to science is because it displaced you from the center of the universe, because that would have been a promotion back in the 16th, 17th centuries. It wouldn't have been a demotion. So the major fighting over astronomy right after the Middle Ages was between those scientists such as Galileo, who were proposing new theories based on new evidence, and those scientists who were committed to the astronomical model of Aristotle. So guess what? Atheists criticized the medieval church for supposedly standing against the advances of science. Where was the church? Which side was the church choosing in the debate? All the university scientists were Ptolemaic and Aristotelian. Here comes this upstart named Galileo, who's a smart aleck, and says, no, I think Copernicus is right after all. And they'd already said, we got rid of Copernicus a long time ago. That's old news. That's 70 years ago. We've already examined it. It doesn't really work. And then Galileo starts to revive this dispute. So I go, it's just the inverse of what the myth is, because the church was siding with the scientists in Galileo's day. But today people make it sound like Galileo was the scientist, and then all these religious people were just nuts. You go, no, what would you expect the church to do but to side with the university? In fact, it reminds me of the current debate, the resistance and criticism that these scientists like Galileo received because they refused to bow down to the scientific status quo that all the universities held. It reminds me of the present-day criticism that creationists receive who refuse to bow down to the status quo of Darwinism. So the ultimate irony about all of this is that, if anything, the Galileo story actually makes us look pretty good. Because if Galileo was a hero because he refused to submit to the status quo, namely the old Ptolemaic Aristotelian system, because of his new arguments from Copernicus and then some that he marshaled himself. And yet he was, whatever degree, was in trouble for that. And he did get into some trouble, but it wasn't torture and all that. Then that's more like what creationists are going through today. because the creationist is the one refusing to bow down to the Darwinists who occupy all the universities, and that's the scientific status quo. You go, well, the irony is it looks like it's just the opposite of what Galileo thought was going on. So there's the numbers book there. But we're out of time, basically. This one goes real fast. I can do it in 93 seconds. Most scientists are atheists, therefore the belief in God is not scientific. What do you say about that? Well, just a couple of quick thoughts about that. It used to be all scientists were theists. So did that mean there was a God back when all scientists were theists? If it means there can't be a God today because no scientist thinks there is, I mean, I'm being hyperbolic. But if the consensus among scientists being atheists is an argument that God doesn't exist, was the consensus when all scientists were theists an argument that God does exist? Did he used to exist and then he went out of existence? That doesn't make any sense. What is more, who knows what the scientists will be believing in the future? So it may be, 100 years, 200,000 years from now, we'll look back on the 21st century and chortle and giggle over what scientists believe. Well, I can't believe we ever thought X, Y, and Z. Because we've moved on, just like we do right now, of some of the quaint things that early scientists might have believed. The fact is, the issue of whether God exists is a philosophical issue. It's not a scientific issue. So scientists, as scientists, are ill-equipped to weigh in on the subject. All I mean by this, in fact, I teach half a semester on this very thought, is that when you're making judgments and researching and trying to think about issues, whether it's a historical thing about Galileo, or a philosophical question like God exists, or an ethical question like homosexuality, or some biological issue like a vaccine for Ebola, whatever the issue is, you have to make sure that the tools and methods you're using are appropriate to that subject. So you don't go, well, if somebody said, well, did Lincoln have a beard? I don't know, I think I've got a calculator or algorithm that'll tell you that. So if you take Lincoln, you multiply by the coefficient of the Civil War divided by South Carolina, that'd be stupid. You don't use a calculator to settle a historical question, do you? Well, in the same token, you don't use the tools and methods of the laboratory scientists to weigh in on questions of whether there's a God. Because whether there's a God is a philosophical issue, not a scientific one. So, because of that, if it's true that most scientists are atheists, even if that is true, that says more about the philosophical influences on them, not the scientific influences on them. So the fact that most scientists believe any given thing that is itself not a scientific issue is completely irrelevant and is illicitly mixing categories. All right, why don't we stop there because we're all tired and I'm thirsty. Have a question or comment or a humorous anecdote. I didn't even offer that option earlier. But you might have a humorous anecdote. You know what a humorous anecdote is? It's funny, at least, whatever else it is. Where's the microphone? Here we go. Catch. Woo!